In this video, I want to talk about the War of 1812. I want to point out at the start that I am not a military historian. That is not my area of expertise or even really my area of interest. So I'm focusing really on big pictures about this war between the US and the United Kingdom. I want to start by mentioning the truth that the British did not want war. As I mentioned in the last video, the British were at war with Napoleon. And during part of this time, they were one of the only powers against Napoleon, essentially. They were in rough shape for a while. And in fact, in June of 1812, they said, you know what? Okay, you are mad at us. You're upset that we are interfering with your shipping. As I talked about in the last video, we are going to be hands off. But it was too late. 2 days before, the US had declared, that should say, war on Britain. This was a big issue at this time period, right? It's not like today. Today, if something happens, right, it gets almost everywhere in the world almost immediately. This wasn't true for most of history. A declaration of war or a peace treaty, as we'll see, could take weeks to get from one side to another. In fact, this happened again even in World War II. In World War II, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they were supposed to tell the US ahead of time, hey, we're declaring war on you, because that was what nations did at that time. And it still kind of is. To do otherwise would be a sneak attack, and that would be just not gentlemanly. And so a telegram went from Tokyo to the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C., telling them, hey, go to the president and say we're declaring war. But there were issues, and the telegram didn't get translated, or decoded rather, in time. And so Pearl Harbor happened before Japan officially declared war on the US, and that hurt Japan's image in the US even more than it would have otherwise. So throughout human history, when we talk about things like formal declarations of war, communication has been an issue, and it was an issue here in 1812. Now, if the US hadn't declared war yet, like if Britain had done this a month earlier, would it have changed anything? I would argue probably not, because as we mentioned in the last video, there were lots of issues that were leading the US to want a war with Britain. Meanwhile, in Europe, in the fall of 1812, Napoleon invades Russia. Unfortunately, I don't get to teach you world history or the history of Western civilization, which are my favorite things to teach. But I will quote my history professor from when I took that course many, many years ago, who pointed out more than once that you do not invade Russia in winter. And if Napoleon had known his history, he wouldn't have done so. Napoleon's Russian invasion is a disaster, and it frees up British forces. Like, France is still an issue, but it's not the same issue it was before. And so by the next year, Great Britain can now focus on the US. Jefferson wasn't president anymore, but he was still, and he wasn't necessarily active in politics, but he was still someone who would write things, and he and Adams had a famous correspondence that lasted until their death in the 1820s. Jefferson thought that Canada, no brainer. It's just going to fall into the US's lap. Basically, we march to Canada and we just take it over. That did not happen. Repeated attempts by the US to invade Canada failed, and they failed badly. In fact, the opposite happened. Fort Dearborn, which is now modern Chicago, fell to an attack by Indians who were allied with the British, we talked about in the last video. General William Hull, who was the governor of Michigan Territory, tried to invade Canada. Not only did it fail, in his retreat, he ended up retreating to Fort Detroit, modern Detroit, and had to surrender that to the British. Now, initially, the US did do better at sea. Like, they had some really impressive sea victories early on. They even, harried the English coast a little bit. But all that did in the short term was it ticked the British off. They got mad, and they blockaded the US. Now, at the same time, while the US is having a blockade along its Atlantic coast, US naval forces do take control of the Great Lakes. Following that, U.S. troops went to York, which is essentially modern Toronto. Now, today, the capital of Toronto is Ottawa. At this time, the capital of Canada, which remember was not an independent country then, was York or Toronto. In that battle of York, a landmine killed dozens of American troops, including General Zebulon M. Pike, he for whom Pike's Peak is named. And the soldiers who survived were so ticked off that their comrades and their commander had been killed by this landmine that they just, without authorization, started setting buildings on fire. And so this is the burning of Canada's capital by the U.S. And I use O here for capital because I'm referring to the Capitol building. But it's also A also works because lots of government buildings were burned. Another important northern battle, to an extent, was the Battle of the Thames. Now, of course, the Thames is the river in England that goes through London, but there's also a Thames in Canada. This is most notable for bringing about the death of Tecumseh, who we talked about in the last video. Tecumseh, by this point, had actually been named a brigadier general in the British Army. William Henry Harrison defeats him at this battle, and Tecumseh dies. This is also well known for bringing Andrew Jackson, the future president, the very controversial president, as we'll talk about in a later video, to the national stage. Early in the war, Creek Indians in the southern U.S. had attacked Fort Mims in Alabama, in modern Alabama, and killed everyone who was inside it. So settlers in the region had taken refuge in the fort. The Creeks attacked the fort and killed the people who were taking refuge inside. Jackson was a militia general from Tennessee, and militia is essentially what we today would call the National Guard. He was initially going to invade Florida. Remember, that was one of the goals, right? We wanted Florida. The U.S. wanted Florida. He changed his plans from invading Florida to attacking the Creeks, and that attack occurred at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where Jackson basically does the same thing the Creeks did at Fort Mims and does it probably more so, killing not just warriors but also women and children. Utterly defeated the Creeks, who agreed to surrender and agreed to move west. Jackson, from this action, earns a commission in the U.S. Army as a major general. So the British strategy had initially relied on what they'd been doing since they first sort of figured out war with the U.S. was probably coming, was that they were arming their Indian allies. However, those Indian allies had lost much of their momentum because of those losses of Tecumseh's death at the Battle of the Thames and the Creek defeat at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And so Britain, now that things are not necessarily like the wars with Napoleon will go on for a few more years, but the tide has turned in Europe. And so they sent part of their kind of elite European army to the U.S. And they were going to deal with what they called, their disparaging term for Americans was dirty shirts. So in other words, those unkempt, backwards colonials. And they planned a three-pronged invasion of the U.S. The U.S., by the way, the U.S. invasion of Canada was also going to be three-pronged. And I didn't really go into it in this video in the interest of time and because nothing came of the U.S. invasion of Canada other than Zebulon Pike dying and Toronto burning. So Britain was going to invade the U.S. at 3 points. They were going to invade in Chesapeake Bay, and that is the area between Virginia and Maryland, which includes Washington, D.C. They're going to invade from the east, like from the Atlantic Ocean there. Lake Champlain here is along the Vermont-New York border, and it borders to the north. It either borders or comes close to bordering Canada. And they are going to invade Lake Champlain. They're going to invade from the north via Lake Champlain. And they are going to invade at the mouth of the Mississippi River near New Orleans. Those are the 3 prongs of the British invasion. Chesapeake Bay, Lake Champlain, the Mississippi River. So you can kind of see from this map that I found online that the areas in pink are British victory. So for example, Washington, D.C., British victory. And in fact, the Battle of Washington, August 24th, 1814, the British win and in retaliation for York, they burn the White House. As they are approaching, Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, the first lady, receives word, and she gathers up some papers. And I'm not sure historically how accurate the gathering of papers is. Like, I was doing some research into it as I was preparing this, and I couldn't find that a lot mentioned in multiple sources. So maybe I'm misremembering that. She at least told her niece later that she did take a copy of the Declaration of Independence that was on display in the White House and basically put it in her purse or put it in her luggage as she was fleeing. And as she left, she ordered that a very famous painting of George Washington be saved, which she became famous for. Now, it should be mentioned, she herself did not carry this painting to safety. She ordered servants, including an enslaved servant, to take the painting off the wall. It was a huge painting, by the way. I didn't realize this even until I was researching this. The painting of Washington we're talking about is like 8 feet tall. Like, this is a giant painting, and so she had servants, both enslaved and otherwise, basically pry the painting off the wall and wrap it up because she thought that the British either burned it or might take it as a battle flag. And then after Washington, the British march on to nearby Baltimore, and there's a fort at Baltimore called Fort McHenry. And the evening of September 13th, a young man named Francis Scott Key witnesses the bombardment of Fort McHenry. He is on a British ship at the time. He is there as an American. He's trying to secure the release of another American who's being held on the ship. And Key famously writes a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, the next morning when he sees that the U.S. flag is still flying and our flag was still there. It is, ironically enough, put to the tune of an old British drinking song, and would become the national anthem officially in the next century. It doesn't become the national anthem until the early 1900s. But the U.S., although they lost the Battle of Washington, although the Capitol burned, or the White House burned, rather, the U.S. survived the British attack at Baltimore. Meanwhile, in Lake Champlain, the nearby town is Plattsburgh. The naval forces of the two countries on Lake Champlain were roughly the same size, but there was a much larger British army. And the U.S. troops there were sort of a combination. There were lots of militia there who were sort of very hastily gathered and not particularly well trained. And the U.S. surprisingly won on September 11th, 1814. And this victory secured the U.S. northern border. So remember, early in the war, the U.S. thinks that we are going to take Canada. By this stage in the war, 2 years later, we are trying to make sure the British don't invade us from Canada. And then the most famous battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans. British veteran troops from the Napoleonic Wars are brought to the Americas in December of 1814. And on Christmas Day, Edward Pakenham, who was actually the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, who was the famous British general who was instrumental in defeating Napoleon, partially at important battles, takes command. So later that year, Wellington will actually defeat Napoleon at Waterloo. But his brother-in-law, well known at the time, takes command. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson, this sort of ragtag group of people, some militia members, some African Americans, some pirates, actually, sort of this random group, are building fortifications along the Mississippi. Early in 1815, the British advance against the American positions, and the British are completely obliterated by Jackson's men. The results of the Battle of New Orleans are a shocking loss for Britain. 700 British troops died, including Pakenham. 1,400 were wounded. In comparison, American forces, 8 dead, 13 wounded. This completely made Andrew Jackson's reputation. Ironically, the battle is fought after the peace treaty ending the war was signed on December 24th of 1814. I mentioned at the start of the video that communications were slow, right? You're going across the ocean in the early 1800s. That could take that would take weeks. It wouldn't take months usually. Like it wasn't a 4 or 5 month journey, but it could be a 2 or 3 week journey easily. Maybe up to a month depending on weather. So the battle is fought. It's actually an American victory. One of the relatively few American victories of the war. Certainly the most well-known American victory, probably the biggest victory of the war. Now, meanwhile, in New England, the British at first didn't even blockade New England because they wanted to keep trading with New England. They also thought this would be a way that they could kind of sow discontent and dissent within the U.S. And in fact, many New England traders made huge profits trading with the British enemy while denouncing Madison in the war. New England at this point was the wealthiest part of the country. But the government couldn't sell war bonds there. So war bonds, what today we call treasury bonds, are how the government would finance things. They still are how the government finances things. And people buy different types of bonds as investments, and at times of crisis, they buy them to support the government. The government could barely sell a war bond in New England. Banks refused to loan the government money even. The government had to go to sort of other sources to get money, including private, essentially what we'd say as private individuals. Most famous New Englander at this time is arguably Daniel Webster. He's a congressman from New England who really led the opposition to the war. And he wanted to know why there was a war with England. And he argued, and he was true in this argument, that it was because Napoleon tricked the president. And that's mentioned in the last video. That essentially when the president said, okay, well, we're going to allow trade with everyone unless you interfere with our trade, then we're going to embargo you, but just you. And Napoleon said, oh yeah, we won't interfere with your trade. Only those evil British will. But of course, Napoleon kept interfering with U.S. trade. He tricked Madison essentially so that Madison continued the embargo against the English or against the British, but not against the French. The U.S. by this point in the war was not doing well. Like it was not going well for the U.S. at all. They also didn't have enough troops. They were poorly prepared. People were calling for war since 1810, at least, or 1811, but they weren't prepared. Attempts were made to draft militia into the regular army, and Webster and his Federalist allies from New England largely defeat those attempts at a national draft. And then the most infamous event in the war that maybe wasn't a battle was the Hartford Convention. That's Hartford in Connecticut. This is in the winter of 1814-15. Again, this is the low point of the war. Nothing is going the U.S.'s way, right? The White House has been burned. The invasion attempts into Canada had been, turned back. Fort Dearborn, modern Chicago, had been lost. Like, just things are not going well. And so a group discusses, should New England leave the Union? Should they secede? Now, the convention didn't agree to that. There was a minority there who wanted to do that, who said, yes, we should be our own country, the country of whatever, maybe the country of New England. But the group as a whole didn't support it. But they thought that they had power because the war was going so badly that they thought the government needed their support for the war to continue. And so they actually demanded a series of constitutional amendments. And they were largely concerned because New England's political power, because of the way representation works in the U.S., with population-based representation in the House of Representatives, and because in the Senate, it's 2 votes per state. New England wasn't getting any more states. They actually did in 1820 when Maine was added, but that wasn't known at this time. And so their Senate power was capped. Like there were no more states to be made out of New England. But there were states that were being made in the West, states like Ohio. And everyone expected that Indiana and Michigan would follow, for example. Similarly in the South, although they weren't states yet, they're a territory of places that are now the states of Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana were all there and were, someday maybe going to join the Union. And so this power was going to, in the U.S., move towards the South, move towards the west. It was going to go away from New England, and they wanted constitutional amendments to try to keep political power in New England. This was actually the third such secession movement in New England. There had been an earlier one over the Louisiana Purchase. Again, this was a new states in the West are going to diminish New England's power. But beyond that, they sincerely believed that the Louisiana Purchase was, the government was overstepping its bounds. And frankly, Thomas Jefferson himself thought the same thing. Jefferson thought the Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional. But he believed, and I would argue correctly, that it was such a bargain that he could not pass it up. Similarly, when he announced that embargo where U.S. ships weren't allowed to trade with any foreign port at all, that devastated the U.S. economy and especially the New England economy, there were grumblings again about seceding. Let's leave the Union. So again, at this point, the Hartford Convention, the war was going badly. The group thought they were in a really strong bargaining position. And then news about first the victory of New Orleans comes, and then news that a peace treaty had been signed comes. And that ends all of the Hartford Convention's hopes. By the way, most Americans, because of the way communications worked at the time, heard about the victory at New Orleans before they heard about the peace treaty. And because of that, they concluded wrongly that the U.S. had won the war. So let's talk about the peace treaty. There had been attempts at peace. So I mentioned that early on, right after war had been declared, Britain sort of backed down from some things. And later in 1812, Britain made another overture and said, hey, we don't want war, but they refused to end impressment. And so Madison said, no deal. If you aren't going to negotiate about impressment, we aren't going to have peace. Russia actually tried to mediate twice. Russia twice volunteered to say, hey, we will be the mediators of peace between the British and the Americans. And the British refused. Finally, in August of 1814, the British and the Americans met in Ghent, Belgium. And there were 3 key U.S. diplomats there. One of whom you'll learn more about as you read, one of whom we talked about in the last video, and one about whom we did not. So John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams, the second president, and John Quincy Adams himself will become president in 1824, I think. Yes, in 1824. John Quincy Adams was a Federalist, but he actually broke with his party over Jefferson's embargo. Like, he supported Jefferson's embargo. And he had just before this been the U.S.'s minister, which is basically their ambassador to Russia. Henry Clay, who we met in the last video, Clay was a war hawk, but now by the time 1814 is rolled around, like, Clay sees the writing on the wall. Clay is not a dumb man. He is intelligent. And Clay recognizes the U.S. is not winning this war. We need peace. And then Albert Gallatin was the Treasury Secretary, and he was actually an important figure because although both Adams and Clay wanted peace, they were two different sides of political spectrum. Right? Adams is still a Federalist at heart. Clay is a Democratic Republican. Gallatin moderates between the two of them. Initially, both sides make pretty extreme demands. The U.S. demands that Britain ends impressment. They also demand that Britain cede at least part of Canada to the U.S. and that Britain help the U.S. acquire Florida from Spain. Britain at first demands that the U.S. cede territory in the Northwest. Again, the Northwest would be the modern states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and eastern Minnesota, to create an Indian buffer state. When that didn't fly, the British suggested that, oh, I know, each side will keep the territory it controls when fighting ends. So any territorial gains that you Americans make, you get to keep. Any territorial gains that we Brits make, we will keep. This was done because they expected Britain to make huge territorial gains, because this is when Britain is planning that three-pronged invasion. And so they initially thought, oh, this is going to be great. We are going to gain territory in the north from our invasion in Canada. We're going to gain stuff along the Mississippi River. We might gain stuff in the Chesapeake Bay. Like, we're going to get territory from this. And they actually postponed the peace treaty, the negotiations, to see what the outcome of that invasion would be. Like, they tried to slow things down. The British government, though, when they heard about this, said, no, we want things to return to the status quo. So I'm a computer nerd. One of my favorite games over the years is called Europa Universalis, a strategy game. I learned this term from them. It is a white piece. And a white piece means that things return to the status quo. They return to the way they were before the war. This is the peace treaty signed by the US and Britain. Now, eventually, they did sign other treaties which did things like end or ease the border disputes between the two countries. Those treaties would come over the next several years and decades. But interestingly, Britain, for example, never officially agreed to end impressment. They did end up stopping it. They didn't do it after 1815 or so, but they never officially agreed to it. Here's the key point. Occasionally, I still see a history textbook argue, oh yeah, the War of 1812 was a U.S. victory. It was not. The War of 1812 was not a U.S. victory. It was at most a draw. Now, you can make some arguments. You can point out Britain at the time was in a tremendously powerful country. And it is impressive to fight a tremendously powerful country to a draw. At the same time, Britain had been going through a huge and painful war with France that had been going on for nearly a decade by the time of the War of 1812 starts. So the U.S. is not at the height of Britain's attentions at first. And even as the war goes on, there's still conflict in Europe. So if you hear someone say, or if you read someone say, oh yeah, the U.S. won the War of 1812, don't trust what that person says, because the U.S. didn't. The U.S. did not get anything they wanted directly from the war. They did not get impressment ending. They did not get a square inch of Canada. They did not, from the war, get a square inch of Florida. And on the high seas for trade, they really didn't get anything there either officially. So unofficially, Britain kind of stopped interfering with American ships on the high seas. But that wasn't part of the treaty. So don't read too much into the War of 1812. The U.S. didn't lose it, right? No territory was lost or anything like that. But it was not a victory. There was one more war that was immediately followed the War of 1812. This is a war against Algiers in North Africa. This is known as the Second Barbary War. The First Barbary War was around 1800, give or take a year, where the Barbary pirates were attacking American and other merchant ships. And during the War of 1812, they started again because the U.S. was otherwise occupied. And so the American naval officer, Stephen Decatur, goes to the Mediterranean with a couple of ships, and he forces the various rulers in North Africa here to stop attacking U.S. ships and, in fact, to pay reparations for attacks that they had done. And this actually did more for U.S. trade on the high seas than the War of 1812 did. This map is actually a map of the First Barbary War. That's where the arrow here comes from. If you're familiar with the Marine Corps hymn, which includes to the from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The shores of Tripoli is referring to Tripoli in what is now Libya. At the time was actually called Tripoli, but the city of Tripoli. And that's a reference to the First Barbary War. I think it was the first one, not this one. I do want to point out that I did use my favorite history textbook both for this video and for the last one about the coming of the War of 1812. It's an old textbook by now. It was old even when I used it when I was taking this course. But I find it very useful. So here's my source. Thanks for watching.